30 seconds, okay.
Then what I'm gonna do?
What's the plan? Is everybody ready? She'll give you the applause cue. You know, it would be really enthusiastic. It would be great.
We should have told some jokes or something.
Didn't you feel good?
You know.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Chrissy Holmes.
And I'm Anthony Germain. We are live at Memorial University's Signal Hill campus here on the Battery in downtown St. John's. The story behind the story.
And we are so happy that you're here with us.
Hello there.
Racing just calms me down and just lets me be me.
You can smoke on your own property.
Anybody in a wheelchair would not have gotten around.
How difficult is that transition?
25 years ago, fishermen in this province were hit with a crushing blow.
His family suspects something sinister.
What was it like to hear that diagnosis?
We were at a point where we just wanted to play music.
Rabbitown has diversified so much in recent years.
We are sorry. I never thought that this would happen.
We are just about to release the bees, and there we go.
And that is just a glimpse of some of the many, many stories that we produce here in Newfoundland and Labrador. And some of them highlight events, some of them emotions, personal stories, things that happen, things that people think about. And they are really stories that connect us with our community, and they all usually start with one person and one idea.
There really is something very special about this place, and it's intrinsic in our history, our people, and of course, our storytelling. It's a spirit that bleeds through in the happy times, but of course also comes through in the darker times.
And as the public broadcaster, we really want to do our best to try to zero in on those stories that demonstrate what makes people and events unique here. And to do that requires building a degree of trust with people. And trust is not something that's easily earned. When people confide things in us, they don't want us to torque what they say. They want us to reflect them as accurately as we possibly can. Trust is really our currency. So tonight, in that spirit, we want to pull back the curtain of how we do things, show you some of the sausage making that goes on in the journalistic factory, and really bring you to the other side of the microphone, a place you don't get to go to that often.
What's the saying, Anthony? It's that you don't want to be in the room when news gets made or when sausages get made?
Pretty much.
Welcome.
Pretty much.
Thanks to everyone as well who's tuning in on Facebook and on YouTube this evening. It's great to have you here. And of course, everyone that is here in our live studio audience tonight. A special welcome as well to our president, Catherine Tate, who is also here.
So let's introduce you to the people who are really going to make tonight a success, the people behind the scenes tonight and now in front. And that is our panel, people that we work with every day. Over here, we have Megan McCabe, Rob Ansell, Jen White, Stephen Miller, and Caroline Hillier.
And on the other side, we've got Zach Gowdy, Bailey White, Ariana Kelland, Fred Hutton, and Ted Blades. Welcome. So over the next hour or so, each CBC NLer is going to be speaking about the work that they do, how they do it, and we're going to be touching on a number of topics. They include trust, as Anthony had touched on, challenges, and inherently change. We're also going to be exploring a lot of different storytelling types because we do tell a lot of different kinds of stories, from news stories to longer format mediums to current affairs, for example. Now, we're also going to be talking about treatments. Many of the stories that you're going to see here tonight are going to be in video, but it's important to note that just about everything we do these days is multi-platform, so many of these stories have been reversioned for radio or for online purposes as well.
And once you've heard from our panelists, I feel kind of weird calling you guys panelists because they're colleagues, rivals, people that we work with every day. We are going to turn things over to you to ask questions, not just here in the room, but of course, online as well. So you will get your chance. Events like this go by like that. We've got a lot to get through, so let's get things going.
We're going to begin now with a very special project that we've done recently here at CBC NL. It's a documentary called Persons First, inside the Wiseman Center. The 30-minute documentary actually aired first 1 year ago this month, last November. And at that time, it clearly left an impression on the audience.
And in just one moment, we'll talk to Megan McCabe, the reporter who took us inside that shelter for people in need.
I was in prison for attempted murders and bank robbery.
Along the way, I was diagnosed with schizophrenic.
I relapsed and went downtown, got on Paul jobs.
CBC NL steps inside the doors of the Wiseman Center, which provides temporary shelter, housing, support, and hope.
Well, our philosophy here that everyone's, first of all, persons. They're all people like you and I.
Join us for our half-hour documentary on November 22nd on CBC TV.
Now, Megan, in that item, we get to meet a lot of fascinating people that you met. What was it like actually just trying to make connections with people inside that shelter?
It was surprisingly easy, and we're talking about trust, and that was the only thing I was a little bit worried about going in, that I come from a very different experience than a lot of the people in that shelter. Some of them maybe grew up the same way that I did, but things went wrong in their lives, and they needed that support. But I was a bit concerned that they would look at me and be like, who are you? I don't want to talk to you. What are you doing here? Get out of our space, right? But nobody was. And a lot of that had to do with the Salvation Army and the staff, I think, facilitating us and our invitation in there. And we were in their house, and they were so proud to show it off and to tell their stories, tell us the difficulties that they'd been through, and also how appreciative they were to be there. They wanted us to tell the world not to judge them, and that they're people just like everybody else. And they were so open. Like, we walked in, and I think it was just really a bombardment. I mean, there were moments like, I remember standing in the hallway talking to this guy who's my age, telling me about his experience. And this other man walks up, Don, and just turns his arms over, and they're just scarred from self-harm not that long before. And then he starts telling his story, and that's just walking in the hallway. And then we had these two really long interviews with the first people you meet there, Johnny. We were in his room it was 50 minutes, almost an hour of a recorded interview. And it looked so comfortable from the shot, but we're like, I'm wedged in behind the table, trying to be skinnier than I am, not breathe. And then there's 2 cameras, and Jen, our producer, and the lights are all set up. But somehow in the conversation, it was really just like the 2 of us talking, and he completely opened up. I joked at the end of it, because he was like, I'm done now. I was like, okay, sorry. I meant to say, if you ever get fed up, just tell me, and it's over. And he's like, no, I really wanted to keep going. I wanted to keep telling you about my life.
I found it so interesting because the feeling of hope really came through loud and clear in this piece. But given some of the harder subject matter that you were dealing with, I mean, was that challenging to get that?
I actually don't think it was, because and I guess that's the thing, right? Everything is a balance. So where there's pain, there's also joy and hope. And because the other thing to think about is that when they're in there, they're getting help. So they're not on the street, they're not in isolation. There's 10 supportive housing units, so for the people, like for Johnny and Aaron, that's their home, and they can't really function, it would be fair to say, on their own. They wouldn't be doing as well if they were on their own and didn't have this kind of access and this kind of support. And they all have that hope that they're going to deal with their addictions or get stable housing. So it was like really, really sad and intense, and it was a lot to process after these 2 really long days of shooting. But that sense of hope never went away either, and just the camaraderie between the people living there, yeah.
You know, in this business, I'm kind of used to cutting people off, but not people I work with. So as tightly as possible, people forget about the production side. So once you get all this, how do you bring it all together?
I literally Googled how to write a documentary, because we had no idea what we were getting when we went in. It could have been like a 6-minute piece or, anyway, and then we clearly had half an hour. More content that we were able to use on the radio that didn't get into the documentary, and then a really immersive website with more content that didn't make it into the documentary. So after Googling that, painstakingly going through all the tape, like I could probably recite every interview. That's how much I agonized over it. It just came together fairly easily with the team's work. Yeah.
That's Megan McCabe, of course, a reporter at that point. Nowadays, she's working as an assignment producer. Megan, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
CBC is known for news. We're known for investigative journalism, breaking news, enterprise journalism, but we're also making a move into what we're calling the news of life. So the People Project is about telling stories about people in the community. It's also about our people internally, about changing the culture of how we think about storytelling, thinking about the kinds of stories we tell.
What this project is kind of about is broadening the tent, bringing people who are not our hyper-loyal readers into the CBC more frequently. We've been hearing voices that you wouldn't hear of a whole lot. And maybe people that we would never have considered otherwise as a story that needed to be told.
For years, we've always called it the story lineup, not the news lineup. Because if you call it the news lineup, in your head, it's, you know, politics, fires, that usual heavy daily news material that doesn't have a range.
I don't think it really matters to them that we go, ooh, that's not really hard news. For them, they go, God, that's a really good story. I have to tell people about it.
You know, people have a range of interests in their lives. That's where we're trying to put a focus in, give people a place where they can tell the story of what's going on in their life.
Well, you'll probably recognize our next panelist's voice before you recognize his face. Ted Blades is the iconic voice behind On the Go's, CBC Radio's On the Go, and he's actually been in that gig for 30 years.
Yes, and despite his chronological advancement, Ted brings a curiosity to his job every day. We all see that in the work that he does, and Ted wants to talk about the simplicity of and the value of a simple idea. Mr. Blades.
Journalists are a lot like everybody else. We tend to overthink things. We try and figure out how are we going to do this? What production values do we bring to it? How do we make this fancy? But Peter Gullidge said to me one day, I got an idea. He said, you know how you go for a walk and you never know where the conversation's going to go if you take someone with you. Go find some smart people with some interesting things to say, take them for a walk, and let's find out what happens. So that's what I did. I rounded up some people. I canvassed my colleagues to find some people to talk to. And I took 6 of them out for walks on the trails around the city of St. John's. I took Dr. Susan McDonald out. She's the head of palliative care. We walked around Octagon Pond in Paradise. And we talked about what the dying can teach us, the living, about the value of life. I talked to Joanna Barker, a young musician, about what it's like growing up Mi'kmaq in central Newfoundland when being Mi'kmaq was not fashionable, and what it's like being a young woman in the music industry in 2017 when there's still an awful lot of misogyny on the go. I talked to Ashley Martin Hanlon, who's a young woman who grew up in a wheelchair, about what it was like going through puberty and becoming a woman at the same time being physically disabled. We went for a walk, she in her chair, me on my feet, around the Avalon Mall. And we went in and out of all the stores that she had tried to find something that she could wear when she was a kid. We talked about all of that. We talked about how there are still shoes in store windows that make her angry because she's never going to get to wear them. But the one that I wanted to play a clip from for you tonight is from one that won the Atlantic Journalism Award for podcast, the inaugural podcast award at the Atlantic Journalism Awards. And we picked up one for a walk I did on Signal Hill with seabird biologist Holly Hogan. And she spends most of her time at sea, observing marine life. And I wanted to talk to her about what she learns at sea and how that informs her life on land. And the clip I want to play for you, we're partway through the walk around the Signal Hill Trail, and she stops for a moment to call birds to her, and they come.
So we climb the hill.
What is that?
That's a junco, a dark-eyed junco, and they're checking out that sound that I'm making. And there's a yellow warbler coming into the sound as well.
And who were you trying to be there?
Well, I've heard a bunch of theories about this, and I don't know if any of them are true, but what I've heard is that it imitates the sound of an annoyed owl, and birds often try to harass owls for some reason. So, and I have no idea if that's even true, but
Owls
it really
are the
works.
unpopular kid of the bird world?
Exactly. It's true. I've seen lots of birds mobbing owls.
But that sound usually works.
It does.
And it did.
I'm not sure I buy that rationale, but it definitely works. See, they're all coming in there now. It's a great trick for helping people learn birds and trying to encourage your children to be interested, which has only worked to a limited extent for me.
Right. Let's go up the hill.
Okie doke.
That moment, we were looking out at the Atlantic, and I said to Holly, what do you see out there that I don't see? And she goes, I see possibilities. And 5 seconds later, I kid you not, a whale leaps out of the water. So I don't know how Holly does it, but I was glad we booked her. We put them up online as podcasts and encourage people, look, if you don't have company on your next walk, take one of these with you. One of the things, though, getting back to the simple idea, though, is I've gotten a lot of feedback from people who talked about the production values, the sound that was in it, the quality of the audio. And I said, there are no production values. That's the wind and the birds and the waterfall. As we walk past the waterfall, it increases in volume. You hear the water, and then it goes away again. It's the sound of the world around you simply recorded and played in the background as we walked. We're going to have another season of them, the next season we do. I'm going to talk to photographer Tom Cochran and award-winning author Elizabeth DeMariaffi. Before I hand over the mic, though, to the next panelist, I just want to extend what I said there about simple ideas to simple questions. We've just had a great deal of success last week with a documentary I did about British school kids who have made a connection with some Newfoundland soldiers and a nurse who are buried in a cemetery in London. That whole project that they do, the whole project that I've been dining out on for years, started with a little girl seeing a grave without any poppies on them, say, why don't they have any poppies? And her teacher said, why don't we find out? And from the simplest idea can come some of the best stories. And, you know, I think that's something that we need to try and remember. You know, what is the simple thing? What is the core issue, the core question? And don't fret about it more than that. And as Peter says, let's do things and air our experiments. We can't afford not to. Let's put them up on the radio or online and see what people think.
The amazing Ted Blades, and I'm still trying to make that sound in my head. You probably spent a couple of days after that trying to do Holly's bird calling sound.
No, no birds would come to me.
I'll do that away from the mic a little bit later. Of course, Ted Blades, host of On the Go, just one of the many amazing programs that we have here on CBC Radio.
At CBC NL, we do news and we do current affairs. We have 8 radio current affairs programs in this province. 3 weekday morning shows. One comes from St. John's, one is co-hosted between Gander and Corner Brook, and there's one from Goose Bay. We also have our noon phone-in show, our afternoon drive program, and of course, then there's the broadcast. In addition to that, we have our Weekend AM, our weekend morning show, and we have Atlantic Voice, which is co-produced between St. John's and Halifax, mainly feature documentaries. The beauty of current affairs is like a blank slate, a platform that we can try a variety of treatments and do a variety of stories. So everything from survival information like weather and traffic, things you need to know on a daily basis, to news, to bringing you original stories. When you're talking about 70 hours of programming per week, and we want mainly original stories, it takes an awful lot of work to get that together. So that's from the editorial perspective. You find the stories, you produce the stories, you put them together, you air them.
Will I call you back on this number?
But then behind the scenes, there's our technical crew, and we couldn't put anything together without them. They make the magic that actually get us on the air. We wouldn't be anything without our technical crew.
Now, if you're just tuning in, we're coming to you live from MUN's Signal Hill campus. This is the story behind the story. We're trying to peel back the curtain and let you know how we actually make stories at CBC Newfoundland and Labrador, from the initial pitch, the initial idea, to all the production involved, and of course, to the people who we interview, and we're looking at the impact these stories have as well. I'm Anthony Germain.
And I'm Chrissy Holmes. Most mornings I spend right next to this guy over here, Fred Hutton. And if you listen to the show, or if you know Fred, you probably know that he really likes his phone. Actually, they duplicate. He has many phones, and he's always double fisting them. But they're pretty handy because when he's, how do you do this? Just describe what you're doing at 4 o'clock today, Fred, with your 2 phones.
Oh, really? You want me to say that?
I thought it was hilarious. It explains everything about you.
So morning show people sleep in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So it was in my bat cave, and the phone rang, and it was a story tip. So I put the phone on my chest and spoke on speaker to that person and typed the notes into the other phone.
That's why you need 2 phones.
And you can do that anywhere in the world, as long as you're connected.
And you know what's
and
so...
have 2 phones.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to cut you off, but you're used to it. It's so amazing because those phones, both of those phones are going all the time because people call Fred with news tips. We were at an event last week or something. This 14-year-old comes up with and says, "Hey, Fred, look." Like, even the 14-year-olds know to go with Fred. But I mean, how do you do that? What is that you have?
You have 2 phones. Every week I get a notification saying that I spend about 9 to 10 hours per day on the phone. Now, a lot of that is while I'm working, right? Obviously, like even on the air, you know, you're tweeting or doing stuff like that, chasing, just scrolling through stuff while you're doing an interview, I might be. But it's just basically being connected. I guess that's what we do. That's how you find out what's going on in the world. And lots of times people just reach out to us. You know, not just me, other reporters have the same kind of thing that, you know. I always have this, when I go out of town, I always have stuff with me from the station, so that if I meet somebody, yeah, you can get a hat, but you got to give me your phone number. So if I ever need to call somebody in this community to find out what's going on, and I give them my number, and people always say, "We tried to get a hold of you." I'm like, "Well, I'm in the book," because I want people to call.
Going back to what you said about currency.
Yep, absolutely, trust. Now, you're going to set up something that we're going to hear in a moment, but I always sort of hear is that when I'm out there, people say, "Why is it that Fred Hutton seems to know about accidents and fires before they actually happen? Is he ever a suspect?" And is it,
no, it's because I know somebody who has who tracks these things and phones me first to say there's something on the go, so you need to go. And oftentimes, if there's a public safety issue, it's important to know these things.
So where do you want to take us?
All right. So you know, when Amy came to me, she said, "I want to look at some stories that you've done over the past year or so, you know," and I've only been with CBC for 13 months. And it's not just the daily news chase. These are stories that were basically a little bit deeper in terms of, I guess, what people were feeling. And that's kind of what, you know, Ted was talking about. It's just beyond the daily news chase, just talking to people. And I guess after a number of years, people tend to have a certain level of trust. I mean, that's the kind of thing you learn in kindergarten and from your mom very early in life, is treat people the way you want to be treated. And, you know, after a while, they just get to know that you're going to be trustworthy, which is why they will open up to you. And the first story, the first clip you'll see is a young man who watched his uncle drown. He had to leave him last year because their snowmobile went through the ice, and he tried for over an hour to get him out, and he couldn't. I asked to do an interview with his family, and they said, "Sure, come on into the hospital," which I never expected them to say. And I will say this, that when we left, and the 2 cameramen who were with me, 2 camera operators, I don't think we spoke the entire way from the hospital back to the CBC, because we just couldn't believe what we had just witnessed, that somebody had opened up like this.
He was losing energy. He could barely keep himself up. I couldn't lift him up. So I told him that I loved him and that I miss him. And had to leave him.
I heard a loud noise, a bang, and I stopped for a minute, and I looked out the door, and I could see Stephanie lying on the floor in front of where my doorway was to my office, not moving, and I saw a shotgun.
Did you ever think about quitting when all this was going on?
No,
No, I never did.
That your attention needed to be at home rather than this?
No, because I was always very close, and I can tell you right now that my daughter, that's the last thing she would have ever wanted me to do was quit because of, you know, the issues that she was dealing with. She's always encouraged me to do this job. And she always felt, and she encourages me even this morning with text messages and saying, Dad, you know, you're doing a good job. I'm proud of you. Continue to do what you're doing. And
what does that mean to you to get those texts from her?
It means a lot. And she also knows that if she needed me to be closer, well, I would be there.
This has obviously taken a toll on you, sir.
Yeah, I'm a parent who just happens to be the Premier of the province.
So that was Dwight Ball, of course, referencing, for anybody who doesn't know the story, his daughter was at one point in time connected to a person who was charged and ultimately convicted of a murder at the Captain's Quarters Hotel. And it was actually, and Rob Antle is going to talk about this a little bit later, the I Unit did a tremendous amount of work for months and months behind the scenes following this court case. But I can tell you that I've interviewed every Premier and Prime Minister since 1989, and it's the only time I've ever seen an elected official cry like that in an interview. But that was Dwight opening up, and he was actually the person who led police to the guy who was charged. In the middle, you saw Laurie Chaffee, who we just interviewed last week. Up until last week, I had no idea that there was anybody else in that medical clinic in DeGraw who witnessed that murder-suicide. And it was through just a conversation with another nurse I'm working on a story with now. She said, this woman is going to come into town to tell the nurses union her story. You should talk to her. I phoned her, and it happened within 2 minutes that she told that story. And the first clip of Blake Williams, I got to mention this. We went out to Witless Bay to interview the family and to go to the scene where the search was ongoing for the man who drowned. And I went in to do the interview with the two sisters, and she said, you've arrived as we're eating lunch. We'll do the interviews in a minute. I said, okay, we'll wait for you in the car. She said, no, you people are going to have lunch with us. And we sat, and that, I don't know if that happens anywhere else in the world, but I know in stories that I've covered around rural Newfoundland, when you're in, you're in. Now, I did turn down a drink. They wanted me to have a drink, but I did have cooked dinner.
We insisted he say that because the president is here.
No, they were very insistent on the drink, but I didn't.
But it really speaks to the level of trust that you have, as an interviewer, have achieved with people. How important is that to you, to establish that trust relationship?
It's the only thing. It is absolutely the only thing that I will protect with my life. Is my trust, is the trust, and my children, yeah. But in this business, it is the only thing you have. You know, you're only as good as your last story and the trust that you gain from people.
Now, Fred, not everything you do is always heavy and somber.
No, well, yeah, you know, one of the reasons I love radio is because you get to do more than the 15-second soundbite. And in radio, you can do an 8-9 minute interview when it takes a little bit of time to get people to open up about things. And we do day-to-day news and we do current affairs and everything, but I also like to talk to people. The two clips you're going to see now are just, one was from a Kijiji ad for a car that was for sale, and the other is this guy who I actually worked with years ago, who left a 25-year career in broadcasting and public relations in politics. And after the death of two very close friends, he was reassessing his life, and at 48, quit everything, sold his house, moved around the bay to run the family farm.
So I grew up in this meadow right here. Do you ever regret? No. Leaving broadcasting or politics? No.
Do you even have your...
Those kids and their Get the gun, Fred! Get off my lawn!
It kind of looks like the Ferrari that Magnum had.
Yeah, well, that's what it's a knockoff of. 308. Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's go.
A lot of people laugh at me, what do you see in the Beatles, boy? I don't know. It's just something I love about them, and that was it, you know?
I have a feeling this won't be your last car, Keith.
Yeah, probably not, Fred, you know? Never say never, hey.
So that was Keith Whalen's 69 Bradley GT, which is built on the chassis of a Volkswagen Bug. And So he had the Volkswagen Bug, somebody gave him that. But the story behind the story there, the part you didn't hear in there, is that he had rheumatoid arthritis, and it took him a long time to build that car through a lot of adversity. And he was a little bit sad having to sell it. And he didn't even really care. He didn't need the money, but that was it.
Fred's got a thing for cars. I'm surprised that Fred didn't buy it. Nice range of stories, Fred. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Fred Hutton.
We're visual storytellers, essentially. Our job is pretty technical, so we worry about things like white balance and focus and exposure, and I guess in the edits we worry about audio mix and stuff like that. But there's a whole lot more to our job than just pushing buttons.
And a lot of times you don't know what you're going to experience when you go to shoot something, so you kind of got to step back and assess the whole situation. I think you get the best out of people when they trust you.
Yeah, well, a good example of that was the story that we did earlier this year. It was on child exploitation. It was a tough one.
As a child, you cannot consent to any of what I went through.
It's an awful story, what it was, and she told it to us.
The one I remember is getting tied to a tree and beaten.
You almost remove yourself from being the camera person. You know, you just kind of, you try to be her friend almost, right? And I did create a pretty good relationship with her. I visited her many times after, and I don't know if that helped her bring out what she had to tell us, but I kind of hope it did.
I think it did, for sure.
Sorry.
It can be tough, sometimes rewarding too, and there are some benefits with the job.
Blueberry grunt into the pan, let's change.
You get to meet people you would never meet, go places that you would never go. You travel, you get, like, you know, this I think is the best job in the building.
Yeah, we got her pretty good.
Well, just a couple of moments ago, you heard Fred Hutton reference the investigative team, which speaks about a whole other parcel of programming that we take on. In case you don't already know, investigative journalism requires a lot of work. Usually involves lawyers, access to information requests, and people like Rob Antle. Rob Antle is the producer with our CBC Investigates team. And Rob, it's very nice to see you here because you're usually behind like a mountain of papers and digging into things. For people that don't really know what it is that you guys do, and Jen, by the way, is also on that team, can you give us a sense of what you do in the I-Unit?
Well, it's really about enterprise reporting. I mean, it's about doing in-depth examinations of issues we think are of public interest. I mean, these are stories that aren't always easy to get, but once we do get them, we try to ask what we think are important questions to the people in them so that our viewers get the answers they deserve. So I think we have a couple of examples to play right now of a couple of recent stories.
So, Here and Now can finally tell you how our soon-to-be premier was plunged into a murder investigation.
Here Now's Ariana Kellen joins us to break this down. Ariana.
But on the same day drivers were dealing with these conditions, something strange happened. The English School District issued a purchase order for lawn mowing and lawn care.
This stuff shouldn't have been that hard to catch, though, should it?
As I said before, we did detect fraud eventually.
The RNC received more than 12,000 security alarm calls in 2014 across its 3 regions. More than 99% of those were duds.
There's got to be a better way than just having a fee tacked on to people.
But the program did have a cost on taxpayers. The access to information documents show an administrative officer was hired in 2016 with a salary of almost $50,000 to help administer a program that didn't exist.
So what has that person been doing?
Well, that position's been vacant now for well over a year.
And what's amazing with this kind of journalism from a viewer's perspective is that some people think this just kind of comes together. And I'll be in the community, people say, you should do more of that investigative stuff, as if it happens like that. Give people a sense, Rob, of the effort and time that goes into producing some of the things we just saw.
Sure. So, I mean, stories we do can take anywhere from hours to weeks or months or even years, really. The story involving the Premier involved a team of us attending court hearings we couldn't report on. It involved CBC lawyers. It involved us going to court to be able to report that story, period. You know, the type of work we do involves a lot of research. It involves, there's information everywhere, and it involves sifting through all this information and trying to find things that are interesting and worth pursuing, you know, to tell these important stories to the public.
This is actually the first time I've seen Rob in about 4 months, by the way, so it's...
You know, I think everybody here would agree that there are challenges with every type of storytelling, but particularly with the investigative stories. I mean, what are some of the more specific challenges? You touch on some of the elements.
Sure. I mean, you need patience. Some stories take a long time to develop. You don't think they're ever going to see the light of day. Where we have more time to do things, you need to become as expert as possible on some of these issues you're asking questions about. You know, there are high stakes involved in some of these stories, so attention to detail is very important. A measure of courage is important, I think, and also making sure you get things right. There's a Carl Bernstein line, I believe, about journalism being the best obtainable version of the truth, and that's what we try to do, put that out there and then let people, you know, make up their own minds about the stories that we do.
Thank you, Rob. And at the outset of tonight's event, I mentioned impact, and there's no question when we see the investigative unit, Rob and Jen at the helm, when their stories roll out, that's where we really see the impact. And when I talk to people, they basically say, thank you, we had no idea that kind of stuff was going on. So it's Rob Antle, our investigative unit.
I think it's the what to cover is the hardest part. I think news is, it's a very broad definition. The news cycle is endless. News happens every day.
And we're on. Here we are.
Good evening, I'm Debbie Cooper.
And that's the exciting thing about it, I think, right?
It doesn't look like new people.
I think every day is a balance. We balance some of these high-impact original stories, investigative stories, feature interviews. We balance those with breaking news.
A significant development at the Muskrat Falls project.
Audience first is something that is first in our minds all the time.
Good afternoon, I'm Ted Blades.
Even with 10 different platforms to land our material, we have to think of the audience as ultimately who it boils down to. Trying to change the way that we've been assigning stories, very visual stories, and to kind of build on the knowledge and the experience and the reputation that we already had with Here and Now.
Tonight I'll take you inside.
And the strong video journalists across the province, our videographers and the editors that we have. I'd like to think, and I hope people will back me up on this, that we get many more days right than we do wrong. There's many days that I've gone home and thought that we really did a great job for the public.
Let's give a big round of applause to the people that we don't normally see here. That was Mike Rossiter there, who is sitting in as executive producer right now.
Yeah.
And we also want to say a big welcome as well to all of the people that are joining us on YouTube, on Facebook right now. Welcome, and it's great to have everyone here in the audience as well.
And you can't talk about the daily news, of course, without talking about what's really important in Newfoundland and Labrador, the weather.
Moving your life from the north to the furthest spot that I could have potentially moved is not easy, but it's exciting. It's a fresh start. I get to be in a new area and learn. Some of the first things that I went to when I first got here were Signal Hill, Cape Spear. What surprised me most, and it shouldn't surprise me, but how gorgeous it is. Beautiful shot there with the reflections. Getting the weather photos. Take a look at this sunrise. It's definitely given me joy.
8 degrees.
Today,
That's not
8
too
degrees?
bad.
Yeah.
I think everybody in their own way is obsessed with the weather.
Are you used to the cold?
Oh, yes. I think in Newfoundland here, it specifically affects people's daily lives and their livelihood. I hope to connect with the community through weather stories and finding weather stories in specific communities. I do want to make it up to Labrador. I think the North will always have a special place in my heart. Definitely next summer when I make it to the West Coast. Got a whole province to explore.
And Ashley loves the outdoors. Loves kayaking, fishing, and hunting. So once we get her out there with a gun, I think we can capture the ratings in this province. You're watching the story behind the story. You're going to see a lot more from Ashley in the coming weeks. We're talking about stories, looking behind the scenes, and want to appreciate everybody who's tuned in tonight on Facebook and YouTube.
And stick around. There's going to be an opportunity for questions from you as well. And of course, you can add those questions interactively on our Facebook page. And of course, we're going to be taking questions from the audience as well. Well, moving on, Last Seen is a 7-part series that aired over March and April of last year. And it was something in the works that took more than a year for Ariana Kelland. It involved a lot of research, cooperation, and as you can imagine, some very difficult conversations. Ariana Kelland is here now to tell us a little bit more about Last Seen.
Hello, Chrissy.
Hello.
I'm just going to say right off the top that Last Seen only had included 7 missing people, but there are far more missing people in the province. So before you watch this, know there are more than that. But let's start off with a little demo reel showing you a bit of what the series was.
Sharon Drover would be 57 today. Her sister still remembers the gift she bought her that Christmas.
She likes Sweet Honesty powder, body powder, and Sweet Honesty perfume, and the automatic tweezers. Yeah.
And you held on to it because you had hoped to
For
give it to
many
her.
years. I was hoping, yeah, well, maybe this year I'll give it to her. Maybe this year I'll give it to her. Yeah.
If someone knows where Aaron Dragonetti is, they're not talking. If he's gone underground, he's done a good job of it.
We have no evidence to support or suggest that he met with any foul play while here in St. John's. But of course, on the contrary, we have no factual evidence to suggest that he left the province.
I think that somebody somewhere has knowledge about this and what happened.
It's clearly a mystery in terms of where Daniel Pickett went on this particular evening.
You can accept it, but I mean, it's still, when you stop and think about it, it kind of like crawls up your spine.
Whoever killed her, I would like them to know that they took someone of value. She wasn't garbage. She was a valuable person in my life and in brothers and sisters' lives. May God have mercy on their soul. I forgive them. That's hard, but I do.
For anyone just watching this, you can probably assume that it took a lot of work to bring all of these people to the table. And for Ariana, it took a lot of emotion. It took a lot of difficult conversations with police as well. Why was it important for you to tell these stories?
Well, for me, it was a personal interest, seeing these names, going on the missing persons website and thinking, like, who are these people? And just thinking how tragic it is that in some of these cases, looking at Sharon Drover, she's been missing for decades. So it's decades and decades of not knowing. And also, the other side of the tragedy there is that there were names on that list that I had never heard of that went missing in our province, and we, in the media, didn't bother to stop and ask, what's the story here? I knew when I did this that I needed to have the police on board. I needed them to trust me, to give me the information so that people paid attention. I knew that it wouldn't be successful if they just said where they were last seen, what they were last wearing. And to give credit to the RNC, I approached the RNC and the RCMP in the summer of 2017 with this idea. And the RNC did agree to meet with me. I brought along Gary Quigley, our videographer, and Peter Gullidge, and we sat down and we said, you know, we want to tell these stories. We're going to go to family members. We're going to go to friends. They may not speak highly of the police. These are all unsolved cases, but we want to see things we've never seen and find out details that we've never heard before, and they did it. So I think that was a really big part of it. And then after that, it was figuring out how are we going to tell this story with a couple of photos of each of these people. And that's where Paul Pickett came in. And this really was, it wasn't just me. This was me and Paul working on this together. We were equally as dedicated to doing this. So we had some reenactments that we did. We shot scenes in different seasons because people went missing in different times of the year. So we had to shoot some stuff in the summer, shoot some stuff in the fall, and then wait for the winter. And then for months, I called family members, friends of these people. I even reached a family member as far away as the Netherlands because two of these people, Aaron Dragonetti and Jessica Hefner, were not from this province. You couldn't look in the phone book or cold call a community and try to find them. It just wasn't possible. So, but of all the people that I contacted, not one of them closed the door on me. Not one of them, even if they didn't want to do an interview, it was almost like, okay, well, where have you been for the last decade, and you know, in some cases. So I was lucky that people were open to talking and built that trust, and then went from there.
And so when Ariana was talking about basically looking at these cold cases, you mentioned Paul Pickett, he's a video editor, and Gary Quigley shot a lot of this. So Ariana, when you started going through all this, was there anything that really surprised you?
No, well, not really surprised me, but made me angry. I spent 2 days in the MUN archives looking for any stories that the Telegram or CBC had done on Henrietta Millick, Sharon Drover, and Pamela Asprey, and these are some of the oldest cases. And it made me angry because, you know, months went by and no one noticed that they were missing, or in the case of Henrietta Millick, she was Inuk, and it seemed like no one really cared all that much. She was a small little article in the corner of a newspaper. Pamela Asprey was a sex worker, and even the words that the police used at the time, you know, she brought this on herself. That was the language used at the time. That wasn't a surprise, but it made me angry. And also, I guess for myself, two of the other cases I spoke about, Aaron Dragonetti and Jessica Hefner, they went missing in recent years. And I was thinking, how did this fly under the radar? How did all of us miss this? And I think, you know, we're trying to churn out news every day, and it's a day-to-day thing. And that took a lot of work to try to find these people and these families, and it did pay off. And I guess one of the biggest challenges is that at the end of it, foolishly, I thought, well, I'm going to solve a case. That didn't happen. But I can say that the RNC did receive a lot of tips after the series went up. They still receive tips. And I still have close relationships with some of the families. I still talk to them to this day. And to them, someone asked about their loved one who their name hasn't been spoken for decades or years. And for them, it was worth it.
So who knows? Keep our fingers crossed, see if there's new information. It's Ariana Killen should mention. You can see Ariana's Last Seen series on CBC's YouTube channel. And check that out there. Ariana's a reporter and a social media producer.
The broadcast is such an iconic program in this province. It was about our environment and our coastal communities and the people who are making their living from the oceans.
And you hear from so many people who say, I'm not a fisherman or a fish harvester, but I listen to that show because I learn a lot about what's going on out there in little rural communities.
At its inception, it was about, you know, what fishers were getting, what prices they were getting for their catch. And in more recent years, it's been about the ocean in general, what's going on the ocean, because there are so many different people who make their living on the water.
We came here 500 years ago for the fish. We're still here for the fish, but we're more than that now.
fish harvesting, tourism,
Oil and gas, aquaculture.
shipping.
We're sending ROVs underneath the waves.
There's so much going on out there, and we're trying to dip into pieces of that every day. These stories are really important to talk about because it's where we live. We live at the edge of the ocean. It's our environment.
The ocean is a vast part of who we are, and we need to reflect it more.
We really need to focus in on what's happening and what's changing in the ocean because it affects people all over the province every single day.
One of the things that we've touched on a couple of times tonight is impact, and sometimes that seems kind of abstract, but impact can be measured in concrete terms, especially when a story results in real change.
Living with a disability in Newfoundland and Labrador. Do we live in a segregated society? From getting groceries to finding love, everything's harder. Join us as we take a candid look at accessibility in this province.
I'm a reporter and producer with CBC Newfoundland and Labrador. As mentioned, I do a lot of work with Rob with the investigative team, but I also, I'm lucky enough to be able to work on some special projects. And Access Denied was one of those. It was a week-long series that aired last fall that I worked on with reporter Ramona Deering. And our goal was to make accessibility top of mind for our audience, to make our community more aware of the issues that persons with disabilities face in their day-to-day lives, and to give a voice to those who often feel ignored. So we wanted to flood the airwaves with this series to get people to look at accessibility in ways they probably never have before. And it was really rewarding, as Anthony mentioned, to see some actual change come about from this series. So the idea of constructive journalism is that instead of focusing on the negative or the issues at hand, harping on that, it's about offering some form of solution, getting people to think about how things can be improved or changed for the better. And that's exactly what happened in this case. There was a positive change that came about from our coverage. So for some of those stories, we actually had some people, persons with disabilities, wear our hidden camera that's used for the investigative unit usually, but in this case it was to let people see things from their point of view. So we highlighted some areas in St. John's that for able-bodied people probably would be pretty easy to get around. But from the point of view of someone who uses, say, a wheelchair or a walker, it showed how some small changes could make a really big difference. So take a look.
The Jumping Bean franchise on Elizabeth Avenue in St. John's is buzzing.
I can't reach back to get the door closed.
As we showed you last night, a woman who uses a power chair, Ashley Martin Hanlon, ran into a snag in the bathroom.
I couldn't get my chair in enough to turn around to reach back and close the door. So I would have had to take care of business with the door open, which wouldn't have been ideal.
Accessibility advocate Joanne McDonald agreed to go to that Jumping Bean location and take a look at the washroom, along with Jumping Bean marketing manager George Murray.
Two things I would point out to you is that I can't really access the soap dispenser.
It needs to be lower,
It needs to be
or
lower
on the far wall.
on the far wall.
Yeah.
This needs to be wrapped. This pipe right here.
Okay.
Because a lot of times, if that gets in any way hot at all, when I'm pulling up, maybe I'm in the summer, and I got shorts.
Bare legs, yeah, right. It needs to be wrapped to be softer, and it needs to be wrapped to dissipate the heat, right?
We had thought we were right in line with the legislation, and of course we are, but the problem with the legislation is just because it means, says it's accessible doesn't mean it's necessarily usable, and that's what I'm learning.
It really puts a spotlight in terms of where the issues are, and it's not with business owners like the Jumping Bean. The issue is with the legislation that we currently have, because it's not up to date.
So Ramona actually did an update on this story in June, and the Jumping Bean on Elizabeth Avenue has made some changes since the story first aired, like some automatic door openers were installed, and there were also plans to renovate the bathroom stalls. And then there's this.
And there's more. Their new franchise on Kelsey Drive has a washroom everyone can use.
So there's lots of room in here. What an awesome response. It's nice when you're able to show someone something, and instead of getting defensive, they jump to immediately putting it right.
I think most of us were surprised when we got an opportunity to see the world through the eyes of somebody that has mobility challenges. What surprised you the most, Jen?
Well, for me personally, the first time I walked into that jumping bean, actually on Kelsey Drive, I just had to smile because before I did this series, because after doing this series, I started looking at the world in a different way. So I started noticing things that I would never have picked up on before. So just walking around town, I would look outside a business. Oh, is there accessible parking? Is there a curb cut actually there that's usable for the person to get into where they're trying to go? And even things like, are there round handles on doors, or are they the more accessible ones you can grab? So I'm hoping for people at home who tuned in that this happened for them as well, that they started taking a bit more care of and noticing the world around them. And because raising awareness and broadening our views and ultimately eliciting change is such an important part of the work that we do here in CBC Newfoundland Labrador.
Thanks so much, Jen.
Thank you.
That is producer Jen White. And because she's not one to toot her own horn, I'll just toot it for her. We should mention that the Access Denied series was actually award-winning. That's not why we do things we do, but it doesn't hurt, right, when it gets an award. Yeah, that's right. So it's most importantly, though, is to see that there actually was a community impact.
Parkway Sessions is a music show that we started as YouTube videos. We were going to do videos for the CBC YouTube page. It's a show produced by the technical team, which is kind of a rarity for the CBC. We're behind the scenes people, so we came up with this show. We brought in artists who were up and comers and established.
Tears, they've all dried up.
You could see someone like a Janet Call or a Matthew Byrne or
All of these things.
Rough Hands, Luke Tremblay. Bridget and Dahlia from Cornerbrook, so they were just kids. We matched them up, and then we got enough of this, and we said, we got a TV show here. So now we're bringing in new artists, and we're bringing in artists that people haven't heard of. People are starting to talk about it, and when people talk about it, that's a good thing. The technical team that does the Parkway Sessions, this is what we do.
Take one.
We work daily news, but this is our treat. This is our playtime. This is our bonus. This is our Christmas turkey, because we have fun, we love doing it. And plus, we're bringing new people into the building, and we're helping, in some way, establish their music career.
Shout out to the Parkway Sessions crew. Well, this next story was of national significance. You might recall that the Trudeau government apologized to residential school survivors back in 2017.
And a big part of that story, of course, was a financial aspect of it in the form of a settlement. Our Bailey White covered the story. I guess, Bailey, just a quick refresher about what led to the apology, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's important because you might be thinking, wait a second, there was an apology already that happened in 2008, but the thing about it was people from Newfoundland and Labrador, residential school survivors from here, weren't included in that. The thinking was the schools here weren't run by the federal government, they were run by missionaries, so it wasn't the federal government's fault. So survivors sued, there was a class action lawsuit, and they won, and that's where this apology came from. That's something that the survivors wanted. But it took years for them to win that. And just to give you an idea, I brought a little segment. This is a protest walk, a demonstration from 2015 when survivors were calling for that apology and that settlement.
I don't think there's ever been an acknowledgement that we went to an institution. We went to a residential school. And I think there was always kind of like needing a recognition of that. And this day provided.
So that was 2015 in Happy Valley Goose Bay, and ultimately that's where that apology took place. There are about 1,000 residential school survivors in Labrador mostly, and also in Newfoundland. And there was a real sense of urgency about getting this apology done, because these people are elderly, and in fact some of the key plaintiffs who launched the suit actually died before the apology took place. So we knew there was a sense of urgency, and we knew that it was really important to people to be able to bear witness. And a lot of survivors were able to attend the apology in person, but a lot weren't. There's 1,000, and they weren't all there. So hundreds of people were watching the live stream at home. But we broadcast it another way as well, and I think it really tells you something important about our relationship with the audience and the decision that we made to put it on the radio. Because as I say, there were hundreds of these people, and a lot of them, probably most of them, live on the coast of Labrador. So if they weren't able to make it, whether it's too expensive or they're not able to travel or for whatever reason they can't come, if you live on the north coast of Labrador and you're trying to live stream a high definition video for hours on end, you're gonna have problems. It's not gonna work. What you do have is CBC radio, and most of the radios are tuned to CBC, 24 hours a day. They're extremely loyal listeners in Labrador. So we knew that that was a way that we were gonna be able to bring this to people who really needed to hear it. So I had the extreme privilege of hosting with Anthony Germain that radio coverage, and my job was sort of to be the eyes and ears in the venue. So it was really low tech. I just had a little microphone, a little lamp, a little clipboard, and I was in the light booth, which was open to the audience, so I had to use my golf voice. Because I couldn't talk too loudly, because it was very somber. People weren't chit-chatting or laughing. You had to be quiet and tell the story of what was going on there so that people could understand. So we do have a clip of that as well.
Well, you can just hear Sarah and Alan now explaining the hutlik. Did you catch all that, Anthony?
No.
She says, well, the hutlik is a traditional Inuit lamp, and it's lit with oil. So she says traditionally we'd use seal oil would be the most common, but caribou oil would be another one. But this is very modern, so she got this at the grocery store. This is just virgin olive oil that she's using to light the hutlik here.
She just gave a very funny bow as well.
I'll tell you more stories later.
So that was a moment of levity, which there weren't many of, but I picked that clip because I feel like it helps you understand, what we were trying to do and trying to communicate to people who are listening at home. It was a very emotional day, and as I said, that was one of just a few real moments of levity. It was powerful, it was emotional. We knew that the people who were watching and listening, this isn't some casual viewing or casual listening for them. And just to bring it home, I guess, why this really mattered so much, we're going to play a little video of Sarah Anilith. She's the one who cracked the joke on the tape there, but she does such an eloquent job of explaining why this mattered so much.
There are many who have the history and the experience of going through very nasty, negative experiences. In association with speaking Inuktitut, being punished for speaking Inuktitut, and saying that drumming and chanting and lighting the hullik were heathens and pagans practice, which that was not what it was. We had our own form of spirituality and our own form of religion before anyone landed on the shores here. It was prophesied, in Oquak Bay region, that when the Inuit drum came back, that the social ills of northern Labrador would begin to subside, and that we would become more empowered as a people against that the experience of colonization. It's back in the youth. The youth brought it back. That is huge. It's the heartbeat of our people, you see. And it was not, we were not assimilated. We were stronger than that.
It's remarkable seeing that because it brings me back to that day when Bailey did all the heavy lifting in a radio special. Was just watching it, that sort of tightness in the chest again, because it was a very, very emotional day. Bailey White recently transplanted to St. John's from Labrador. She is a reporter and newsreader now here at CBC NL in St. John's. And you are watching the story behind the story. I'm Anthony Germain here at the Battery campus, or the Signal Hill campus of Memorial University with Chrissy Holmes. You're watching us on Facebook and YouTube. We will be getting to your questions soon, so if you have them, you might want to get them on Facebook. We'll get some questions in this room as well, looking at some of the stories, of course, stories of impact, stories of motion, and stories that matter.
Well, you can just hear Sarah and Alan now explaining the Hutla.
Okay, just reset. Okay, gotcha. Hello, Chrissy Holmes here again. Well, coming up next, we're going to be moving on down through the line because we want to ensure that everybody gets enough time. And our next two talkers bring a really interesting story. And actually, one of them happens to be the producer of our St. John's Morning Show, Caroline Hillier, along with Stephen Miller. And the way that these two eventually met and started working together is fascinating. Just stay tuned.
I didn't know if each night was going to be Stephen's last night with us or alive in our house, if I was going to get up in the morning and see Stephen OD'd. And just watching him like get sicker and sicker and sicker, and I just wanted him to get better. So I don't think I was ever going to give up on him.
That was the sound of my mother crying. I'm Stephen Miller, and I spent a decade of my life doing the whole drug addict thing. I'm on a different journey these days. It's been about 3 years since I stopped abusing opiates. I was more or less a vampire, and now I'm a journalist. As is Caroline here, and she told my story.
Yeah, so you're going to make me cry already. That applause was lovely. So I'm Caroline Hillier. I produce the morning show with Chrissy and Fred, who are up very late tonight. You guys feeling okay? Yeah, okay.
Sufficiently caffeinated, thank you.
And that clip there from that radio doc was the documentary that I did on Stephen here. Stephen has been through a lot, as you can imagine. He lost his girlfriend to an overdose, and she died right in front of him. He's been in and out of jail. He really has been through a lot.
I never imagined that somebody would want to tell my story. I certainly didn't expect it to be someone who actually knew.
Right, so Stephen and I actually met 10 years ago in university. We met at house parties and class, this kind of stuff. And then we didn't keep in touch, but we had each other as friends on Facebook. And I'm surprised Facebook hasn't come up tonight because we get a lot of our stories through Facebook. And so for years, the last few years, I would see Stephen's status updates and they'd be really dramatic and about, jail and drugs and alcohol. And I was thinking, for a long time before I messaged him that I wanted to message him. And that's one of the advantages to our job. We can kind of be nosy and we can just message someone and ask if they want to share their story. So I messaged Stephen and...
Coincidentally, when she messaged me, I was getting clean from drugs, and I was using the methadone program to do so. And also, I was applying to do journalism at College of the North Atlantic.
Yeah. And why did you say yes?
Well, I mean, who could pass up an opportunity like that? Honestly, I said yes because it's not that long ago that I felt hopeless myself. I never met anyone who, personally, who had made it out of the racket alive. And there's really not that many stories of people that turn their lives around and do it. When you do hear about drug addicts, it's usually in the news with them being led to the courtroom in shackles, or maybe some camera footage of them committing a crime, or worse, you hear about their untimely death through an overdose. So I was happy to be the example of somebody who went a different route.
Yeah, and a lot of people with Stephen's story, they wouldn't want to talk to a journalist. Again, messaging people on Facebook, a lot of them just don't reply, understandably so. So when Stephen actually said yes, I took it very seriously, of course. I was glad that he trusted me with his story, and I knew that I had to do my very best to do it justice. And I think Stephen would agree that I literally followed him everywhere with my microphone. I invited myself to his 30th birthday party. Thanks. I met his mom. She cried, as you heard, and I cried, and there was a lot of crying. I met his cat. I went everywhere, I think, with you.
Yeah, no, it was, I mean, not that I minded. Or yeah, no, you were definitely there for you were there for the important stuff. You were there for the stuff that wasn't important. You were there for the first day of journalism school, which I'm sure my classmates found interesting. Yeah. I wasn't expecting it. I thought it was, you know, from what I knew at that point of the news, I figured it was like a quick turnaround, but instead I ended up with a shadow.
Yeah, and we do need to do those quick turnaround stories. All of us do them every day. But what I really love to do is stories when we get to know someone, and, you know, doing an interview like Chrissy and Fred do dozens of interviews in a day. Doing interviews is great, and you learn so much about someone, but when you can actually follow someone around in their day-to-day life, it reveals so much more than you know, a question and answer kind of thing could. And you know, when I was doing the story, I'd message Stephen and I would say, he's kind of wondering, you know, when are you going to tell the story? When is the story going to air? And I was like, I just want some more. I want some more. I want to come to your birthday party again. I want to, you know, drive to your doctor's appointment with you. So I think when it was finally finished, like, what did you think that when it finally did air?
Thank God it's over. Hearing it was fine. As you said, it was the waiting to hear it that kind of I struggled with. I couldn't remember half of the things I'd said to you, and in the early days, I was on a fairly high dose of methadone, so it could have been anything, honestly. But since the story came out, I've had dozens of people message me, and I got to say, like, some of them people I knew before, some of them are strangers from across the country, but everybody said that they found value in the story and that it helped them in some way. So, you know, it's not very often you get to make a difference.
Yeah, and he did make a difference. Even your a probation officer that you hadn't spoken to in years, but after he heard the radio story, he tracked you down. He called your parents' house, right? And then he tracked you down to say congratulations. So that was great to hear that. And, you know, when I talk about following someone through their day-to-day life, something that was revealed to me was that Stephen, when he was in prison, he wrote a novel. He wrote a novel while he was in prison. And
lots of free time.
And when he told me that, you know, I, of course, wanted to include that in the story, but instead of just having him tell me about the novel, I asked him if he would read some of it and record it so that I could weave it into the documentary, and he agreed to do that. And so I took him into the CBC studio, gave him some voice lessons, and left the studio, let you record by yourself for a little while. And that, you know, when Stephen was in the news, he was in the newsroom, he got a tour, and then he went to record the novel excerpts. That was the first time you were?
It was actually the first time I'd seen like a newsroom, and just seeing so much important work being done by talented people, like I really wanted to be a part of it.
And he has been a part of it. Cue our clip here. So Stephen actually, on his own, got an internship with his journalism program at the College of the North Atlantic. It was a 4-week internship, and since then you may have seen him because he's been a casual while he's studying journalism. So here he is.
There are a lot of big prizes coming up this week, and as you've heard, there's still $1 million jackpot waiting to be claimed. So check those tickets, people. This winner's parking space could be reserved for you next. Stephen Miller, CBC News, St. John's.
And it's great.
Face for radio.
He calls me his work mom because I'm always like, okay, stand up straight, hold your mic. So, but having Stephen in the newsroom has been so valuable because it's important to me, and it's important to CBC, you know, in our mandate to be diverse, and not only to be culturally diverse in the newsroom and in the people that work in our newsroom, but it's important to, you know, hire journalists that are from underrepresented communities. And Stephen here has been really valuable to have in the newsroom. His life experience, you know, it shows he has empathy when he's interviewing people. He really, it is really important and to have him in the newsroom.
And to be back in the same radio booth like that I'd been in reading parts of my novel in just a few months before, and everything else, honestly, has been really, really surreal. Some of my colleagues at work, they were familiar with my story, and others weren't. And the fact that it wasn't immediately obvious was a good sign, I thought. There's one story in particular. It was a story meeting, and we were all discussing a story that involved prison. And so I offered some insider knowledge, we'll say. And a producer on Here and Now, Lee Pitts, he inquired as to how I knew so much about it. And he asked me if I'd ever worked in a prison before. Not quite.
The amazing Stephen Miller and Caroline Hillier. You know, we're going to move on to the question and answer period, but I think actually just in terms of full circle, Stephen, because you represent one, like we've been talking from one side of the mic here tonight, but you kind of have the advantage of being able to do both, right? Having been on the other side of the mic and now holding the mic. What did that experience that you had as the person, as the focus of the story, teach you about how to be a proper journalist? What did you take from that?
I'm not going to lie, I learned a lot of tricks from having her follow me around.
She's good, she's good.
She taught me all about wild sound, which Mr. Blades was talking about earlier. There's really no replacement for it. And just, you know, everyone that I've had the pleasure of working with always carries themselves, you know, so well, and they're empathetic, and they're very good at what they do. And so I just basically was like, act like the rest of these people.
Amazing stuff. Well, now it's time to get to the question and answer period.
Not quite.
Not quite.
Not quite.
Okay, skip ahead.
No, that's okay. No, we got this.
I was kind of hoping that would happen, actually.
I'm so sorry.
We tell stories about real people, and they're ordinary people doing, I like to say, extraordinary things.
Seeley grew up in a remote northern outport near Hawke's Bay.
And sometimes they don't even realize they're doing extraordinary things. In the beginning, it was very much an industry-oriented show.
A busy place on a summer morning.
The programs were 80% fishery, a little bit of farming, a little bit of logging. Now it's much more of a human interest, lifestyle kind of a program that reflects our way of life. It's all about us. I feel that our responsibility is to tell good stories. In doing that, we have also captured and archived a lot of our culture and our traditions. You go back through all the years of land and sea programs.
Now, is this stuff as popular as your salmon?
It's like getting a PhD in Newfoundland culture. It's a tremendous body of work. There's a story, there's a show underneath every rock. It's just such a rich place. A lot about Outport Newfoundland has actually stayed the same. The heart of Outport Newfoundland is the same. People still have a party in their shed on Friday nights. People still go rabbit catching in the fall. They still go moose hunting in the fall. There's still a piece of salt beef in the pot on a Sunday. The heart and soul of Outport Newfoundland is still strong, and I think that's great.
It's an amazing show. Sometimes you drive around the island, especially around the bay, you get out of a CBC van, people say, "You're from Land and Sea, you're from Land and Sea." And I'm from Here and Now. And they go, yeah, you can still come in. But it's an amazing show with a lot of loyalty out there. Throughout the night, we've seen a lot of reporting that is informative, emotionally compelling. And sometimes we produce journalism that just on the face of the practicality of the information is exceptionally strong and focuses on issues that affect all of us in our daily life. And Zach Gowdy is here now to give you a glimpse into some of the stories that he has recently done.
Yeah, you're talking about news you can use, which is like an old chestnut in broadcasting, but it's a format that persists because it works, it really works, and it continues to be very popular. One reason I think is because it's a format that speaks directly to the audience. So most of our journalism gives you something to think about. The kind of constructive stories give you something to do in your own life, and that's very powerful. And another thing I think that separates that kind of storytelling is that, again, most of the journalism reporting you've been hearing about tonight is about bringing you new information, stuff you've never heard before, and in the best cases that we strive for, things you can only get from CBC. But this kind of stories really often is about bringing together information that exists out there. Sure, people could go and find it on their own, but oftentimes the information isn't all in one place, or it's confusing, or then you're also just putting the onus on the audience to be able to do that work themselves. And here we're saying, no, we've done that for you, and we've taken an issue and we've boiled it down to what you need to know. And those of you who are really into media and media watchers will recognize that phrase, what you need to know, being written into headlines everywhere all the time. And in this age of information overload, it's not hard to understand why. So we can take a couple quick looks at some stories like that. Here's one that we did on the issue of cannabis legalization. Here's an issue where literally every single thing about this issue was going to change overnight. So 1 week before the big day, we presented our audience with what you need to know. Anyone over 19 can buy marijuana from licensed retail stores. In Newfoundland and Labrador, there'll be around 30 locations spread across the province. Many of them are in Dominion stores, but some are in specialized shops. The price will be between $6 and $12 per gram. The maximum amount you can purchase or possess in public is 30 grams. You can buy dried marijuana, marijuana oil, plants, or seeds. Edible products are coming later. You can also order marijuana online at shopcannabisnl.com. Upon delivery, you'll need to show a photo ID to prove your age. They won't leave marijuana in the mailbox. You can smoke on your own property, in your house or in your yard. When it comes to an apartment or rental property, smoking may or may not be allowed. Depends on the terms of your rental agreement. But like alcohol, you can't smoke in any public places. Not on the streets, not in the park. And again, all of that information was out there, but here we've put it together in a way that hopefully is fun and engaging for the audience. It works in places where the audience is already going, like Facebook. And after that video was published, the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary shared it on their official Twitter channel. And I got a thank you from the Newfoundland and Labrador Liquor Corporation, which administers legal cannabis and this products. And they both said, hey, here we are being deluged with questions about this issue, and here you've put basically all the answers into one package and put it out there for people. And here's an example of that same kind of treatment used for a more complex issue. In Atlantic Canada, the CBC stations have decided to focus on the issue of single-use plastic. It's a big environmental concern, especially in coastal regions like ours. The series is called Waves of Change, but when we wanted to launch this ship, one of the first questions that you have to address with a series like that is, what is single-use plastic and why is it a problem? Those are the first questions the audience is going to ask. So we wanted to put the answers out there right away in the first piece of journalism we did with this series. Of all the plastic produced in the world, about a third of it is just packaging. A bottle or wrapper designed to be thrown away in minutes will last on this planet for 1,000 years. So where does it all go?
Because a lot of single-use plastics, especially packaging, are very light. They blow out of landfills, they blow out of transfer stations, so even if there's no litter involved, they end up in the environment where they last for a very, very long time.
A big thanks to Dr. Max Liberand from Memorial University for adding her expertise to that video. And there we created, that series is meant to be very interactive with the audience. There's a Facebook group that has a lot of members. There's always a big discussion there. There's also a simple email address, though, called wavesofchange@cbc.ca. And every single day since that series launched, we get notes from regular people out there who want to be part of that conversation, who have their own ideas, who perceive problems, overuse of single-use plastic that they see in their own lives, or they have constructive solutions for it, and which is a great conversation that we are proud to be part of.
All right, Zach Gowdy. Zach, I bet that week you were on the weed. Remember that week?
Yeah, I remember that very well. There have been probably, I've been in this racket for about 15 years now, and there have been probably 4 or 5 times in my career when a huge international story winds up taking place here, and I wound up being part of it. And sometimes they're fun, great stories like Chase the Ace, right, that blow up, and everybody everywhere was talking about that. Sometimes they're really not so fun. They're the tragedies, that wind up making the international headlines. But there was another story because of our great, geography and virtue of being the first place, right, in North America, in Canada certainly in this case, to legalize marijuana, the crush of cameras, the international media, just the global spotlight. And I had people writing me from all over the world. Our colleague Adam Walsh in Tokyo, who's on an exchange, was seeing us there. A friend I met at a wedding from London was writing about, like, that's that guy I met this summer. Yeah, it was an interesting week.
It definitely was. You were in the middle of it all, but also how many people were asking you specifically, because you became the expert, right? Inherently, like people just started saying, ask Zach this. Like I was getting texts.
Well, I would just say
Ask
that,
Zach.
yeah, I would just say that happens when a big story, when you wind up covering the big story, each of us has had the experience of sort of becoming the subject matter expert in the room. And it's, something you're happy to do for your colleagues, but you also take just as seriously and making sure everybody in your room that you're sharing this information with, has the right stuff in the same way as you take that care in the conversation you have with the audience all the time.
Okay, Zach, as things have evolved, we only have about 5 minutes for questions. Go figure, a room full of journalists. Some of you went over time. You know who you are. We will get some of the questions that we have online. We're not going to get to them all, but I promise for those of you who have sent us questions, we will get answers to you, even if I don't get to ask them. If there are people in the room that want to ask questions, we'll get to you as well. But maybe I'll just start off with a general question. Again, we're tight for time, guys, so this will be whoever fights for the mic. A very simple question, almost goes to Ted's point about, don't overthink things. This is from Grant Pelly. He says, how do you guys go about finding an idea for a story? Where do you start looking?
Yeah. My phone. No, sometimes they bang on the door and they come to you. Sometimes people just need help. They're exacerbated by, whatever's been going on, or exasperated rather, and they just say, like, we need you to bring this story to the public so I can get change done. And usually when we put it out there, if they need help, they get it.
And sometimes as simple as driving by, seeing something going, what is that, right?
That was the point I was just going to make. One of the things that we believe in on the go is this, again, the simple question, well, why does it work that way? Who made that decision? Who pays for that? If we're curious about it, we live in this place as well as everyone else. Maybe other people are.
Anyone that side?
Oh, yeah, I think there's far more stories to do than there is time to do them. I know even out of the Wiseman Center project, I think we still have 2 pages of really great, not that hard to do stories to do, but there's just every day there's such demand. But yeah, it's going around the world and talking to people and turning it into stories.
A person named Angie O'Connell is singing her praises, Megan saying, it was a pleasure to work at the Wiseman Center and with the residents, and a pleasure to have met you there in previous interviews, and that you were very respectful and professional.
Nice. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? I can scoot over to you. You need a couple more to grease the wheel? Okay. Anthony?
Yeah, there's another question here. Stacy Moriarty says, this is for any reporter who wants to answer it. Obviously, there are aspects of many stories that cannot be shown to the public for a variety of reasons. How hard is it sometimes to deal with some of the unfortunate scenes that you come across, particularly with respect to accidents and violent crimes?
Ooh.
Ariana, I think this is your specialty.
I don't know why you would say that. I've covered a couple of murder trials now, and you do see things that you don't want to see and things that we would never show the public. And I'm sure Fred and we covered a trial together, and you hear things and you see things that the average person doesn't have to see. I can't even remember the question. Is it how do we deal with it?
Yeah, and how do you decide what you're not going to show?
Oh, how do we do taste? We discuss things. We have producers, and I mean, you kind of know what you should and what you shouldn't. We do have journalistic standards and practices, but you also kind of know in your gut what you should and shouldn't show, and you just talk with other people in the newsroom.
How about the tension of social media? We can be covering something like somebody taking their own life or an accident where Facebook and Twitter has identified somebody. Everybody in the province seems to know who the deceased is, because of social media, and we're still, anybody struggle with that?
That's a good one. Megan,
Yeah,
maybe
we
we'll
have
pick
this
that up.
conversation a lot, especially in all the different hats that I wear in the newsroom. And so what I stand by is that there's still a difference. And I think that the public doesn't have quite the same understanding of, like, say, a public post on Facebook, and that, yes, everybody can see that, but it's not in everybody's face the same way that our website or our radio or our TV newscast is. And that's how we make those decisions. Thinking about family members, friends, what they already do or do not know. Yeah, and recognizing that it's still different, us versus the internet.
Thank you very much. Just still
Haley?
making space for any audience questions. I'll come scoot to you. Okay, you pick up the
Go ahead,
answer
Bailey.
there while I make my way over.
I just wanted to add that because of that it's already out there, and I think it is sort of changing. I think one of the things that keeps coming up here is when you talked about, people wanting to tell their story and being surprised. Sometimes you reach out and you're surprised to find that, you know what, yes, this person who lost a loved one to suicide does want to tell you that story and does want that to be public. So sometimes, you do it with grace and you do it with tact, and you say, listen, if you want to tell me to get out of your face, I completely understand, but it doesn't hurt to ask sometimes.
And we have a question. We have a question here from Lloydetta as well. What is your question?
I'd like to know, especially when you cover stories that are so traumatic, whether it's someone losing a loved one or like people being being abused or go through some sort of like, how do you deal with that trauma? Like you have to go and you have to tell us the story, but what happens when you finish the story? What happens to you? How do you deal with that?
That's a good question. Fred's grabbing the mic. He's got some experience there.
Yeah, it is difficult, and as Ariana mentioned, there are pictures that we see from crime scenes that we would never show on television or on the website, which are part of the public domain, and you could show, but I mean, just through good taste, obviously, you wouldn't. But I think that, it's one of those things, people talk a lot about PTSD now and stress and anxiety, and, I spoke to somebody who works in journalism who got a survey from the States, and he's a spot news reporter, and they said, how many times have you been to a fatal accident, fire, crash scene, whatever, in the last? So he did the math, and if there's, 25 a year times 20 years, I mean, that's got to take a toll on a person, right? You got to be able to, I guess, and as Lori Chaffee said to me the other day, a woman that I interviewed who witnessed her coworker get shot, and then the man who took her life take his own life, she said, I have to compartmentalize that and put it aside. And, even in my own home, my wife says, what'd you do today? And I just go, you don't want to know. You don't want to know what we see. And sometimes you just have to be able to put it aside and realize it's your job. And it's kind of weird and difficult, but we bump into some pretty tragic stories, and you have to be able to do that. And if you can't, you go on to do something else.
And there are more and more journalists actually getting help for these kinds of things because it does take its toll after a while. I'm going to take one more question before we wind things down. Chrissy.
Yeah, this one comes from Prajvala.
Good evening. This is to all the panelists and journalists. This job that you do comes with a lot of responsibility, but whom are you responsible to? To the audience, to CBC, to the story, or to yourself?
To all, I would say absolutely. We are each responsible to all of those things. You're responsible to the audience to make sure you're giving them a full picture of what's happening in their community. That's our mandate as the public broadcaster here, which which we all take very seriously. We spoke, as what Megan was talking about how you handle breaking news. Even if all of the internet people are publishing this information already, we also have to take seriously that we are custodians of the company's credibility, that we are each custodians of the CBC, a great and proud institution in this country, and everything that we do every day reflects on that and becomes part of that bigger story. You're responsible to yourself always to make sure that you can live with the person you are at the end of every day, and the things that our colleagues have talked about when it comes to good taste and just empathy, empathy being one of the most important values I think that any journalist needs to have. But first and foremost, you're responsible to the person who you're pointing the microphone at every day, who's sharing their story with you, trusting you and us with their story, And nothing feels better as a journalist than when somebody contacts you afterwards and says, thanks, you did a great job of telling and sharing my story. And that's why we all get up in the morning.
I was just going to add, yeah, the characters that we interview, like with Stephen's story, I was probably more nervous than Stephen was when it came on the radio. I couldn't even listen to it when it was live because I had to hear from him first to get his reaction, and I think that that's what really matters the most. You know, because these people open up so much to us, you know, and we have a huge responsibility to tell their story and to tell it right, and it's always great to hear from them when after it airs and hear that they're happy with it and that they're glad that they shared the story.
I want to say a big thank you to all of you. I'm going to call you panelists again until I call you colleagues again tomorrow.
Yeah.
I think Ted said it best. I sent a note to him the other day saying how much I loved his documentary. I said I stayed in the car for 20 minutes, and you said
it's the highest of compliments in radio.
Microphone, Ted.
It's the highest of compliments in radio. Is somebody sends you a note or calls you and said, you know, I sat in the car until it was over. That for me is prize number one.
So if you love a journalist, send them a note.
Yeah.
Say,
Tell them you
I
sat in the car.
car for 20 minutes.
When your car breaks down, just tell them, couldn't get out. It was because of you. That pretty much wraps up our evening tonight, the story behind the story. I have to say personally, I mentioned at the beginning how proud I am to work for this organization and looking at everything that our colleagues have produced. We don't often get a chance to see it all on this sort of buffet table like we do tonight, but it really, I know it seems like a lot of this, but a lot of hard work goes into doing a lot of stuff, and we don't often appreciate it. So I just want to say I'm very proud of all the work that you guys do day in, day out, and it's been a real eye-opener for me to see it all together like that. And I hope it's actually been good for those of you who tuned into Facebook and YouTube to sort of see what goes into this stuff. Sometimes you see a story takes 90 seconds. As Rob Antle, our investigative leader, pointed out, that could have taken 90 days, 90 weeks to put together, and we sometimes forget about all the effort.
It's true, and we also want to say thank you, a very special thank you to the people that trust us enough to enter that storytelling relationship, because of course none of it would be possible without people taking the risk to tell their stories.
Yeah.
And usually they're doing it to accomplish a much larger purpose. So thank you.
Yeah, and of course there's no point doing this without the audience. And so for those of you who've been watching tonight on Facebook and YouTube, thank you very much. And we'll see you on the radio and on TV and online tomorrow.
Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the story behind the story.